Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth talk of the IndoPhone inaugural talk series. I am Dr. Reenu Punus, Assistant Professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Palakkad. I would like to begin with a brief intro to IndoPhone for the benefit of participants who may be joining us today for the first time. One of the main motivations for the idea of IndoPhone was the awareness that there is a lack of a formal community within Indian linguistics which focuses on speech-related research. And so we hope that over time we can be part of the process of building a collective of phonetics and phonology enthusiasts in a way that furthers research in these areas. And IndoPhone is a first step in this direction. Concurrent with the IndoPhone talk series, we're also initiating hashtag NoGoda, knowledge and collaborative discussion Agora. And it's intended to be a community of researchers who want to build a non-hierarchical research and collaboration framework that emphasizes the need for a free flow of ideas, questions, data, methods, and science. It's hosted as a server on Discord, so you can also follow hashtag NoCoda on Twitter for discussions around the talks that we host at IndoPhone. There are 5 of us currently working behind the scenes of IndoPhone. Professor Shakuntala Mohanta at IIT Guwahati, Professor Indranil Datta at Jadavpur University, Dr. Somdev Kar at IIT Ropar, Dr. Amalesh Gope at Tezpur University, and me at IIT Palakkad. The inaugural series, which began on the 5th of October and will end on 15th December this year, boasts of an exciting lineup of experts working on diverse aspects of phonetics and phonology in different parts of the world. This, as you all know, is the 4th talk of the series, and I have the honor today of introducing Professor James Scobbie, Jim, who is the director of the Clinical Audiology, Speech and Language Research Center, CASL, in the Speech and Hearing Sciences Division at Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh. It is a world-class center focusing on broadly 2 themes that explore speech, hearing, and language, providing insights into the nature of typical and atypical communication, the sounds of words and communication and discourse. The research at CASL has been funded by such bodies as the EU, the British Academy, and the Economic and Social Research Council. Jim studied cognitive science, linguistics, and artificial intelligence before obtaining his PhD in theoretical phonology at the University of Edinburgh in 1991. He undertook his postdoctoral study at Stanford and returned to Edinburgh after. He has worked on a variety of projects in various capacities, including developmental clinical speech disorders, child speech acquisition, social linguistics, bidialectalism and bilingualism, laboratory phonology, and social variation. He has also contributed significantly to 2 of QMU's strategic areas of research strength, namely the developmental clinical development and refinement of instrumental techniques for the study of speech and their use for the assessment and remediation of speech disorders. Today, Jim will be talking to us on the topic Me, You, and Language, 3 essential perspectives on phonetics and phonologies. Thank you, Jim, for agreeing to be part of the IndoPhone inaugural series. And now it's over to you.
Right, well, thank you very much to you, Reenu, and the rest of the IndoPhone organisers. It's an absolute pleasure to be have the chance to speak to such a group. I think that the difficulties with COVID and everything that's happening around the world at the moment have provided some hard work for many people, but also some inspiration and some motivation to try and overcome some of the difficulties, and that has led to more online teaching and research seminars, which hopefully will become more of a habit so that we can communicate more effectively around the world in ways that previously seemed to be too difficult or too problematic. So it's a real pleasure to be trying to contribute to this series. So I will just bring up the presentation for today. And the title is Me, You, and Language. And I'm going to come around to that sort of theme of three perspectives slightly later in the presentation. I'm going to start off with thinking about phonetics and phonology and some of the work that I've done in the past with colleagues. And as Renu mentioned, I started off in theoretical phonology within cognitive science, which has a very sort of had a very different take. Although my supervisor, one of my doctoral supervisors was Bob Ladd, he very much underpinned my interest in phonetics and phonology, while the dissertation itself ended up focusing almost entirely on the phonological side. But from my perspective, it made some, or I was hoping it might make some predictions, or it influenced my view, and it became terribly important to decide what data was relevant for the formalism, what data was going to be used in the phonological formalism, and what, on the other hand, you could set aside and leave to other people in other specializations to worry about. So that, in a way, has been the ongoing problem or dilemma that I've been thinking about since the 1990s. And I'm not promising you any answers, but maybe just a slightly different version of the question. So basically, I think most of us are aware that working in phonetics and phonology, that there are very interesting phenomena out there at the interface. And when I started off, as I say, I had a particular viewpoint, and the viewpoint was, for a given phenomenon, I wanted to know whether it was phonological or whether it was phonetic. And as time has gone on, I have reached or passed through as another stage, which is to think about the overlap between phonetics and phonology, inspired, I think, very much by the work of Ohala and others in that sort of school, that phenomena might well be not clearly one thing or the other, but in overlap. And that has led me into following much of the work from an exemplar phonology perspective. So that's going to take us through about 2/3 of the presentation. Because if these difficult and interesting phenomena, they're still there. It's not, even if levels overlap, there are still levels. It's not that there is no distinction between phonetics and phonology. It's that these ways of looking at sound phenomena have different characteristics and different properties, and we need to know how to approach individual phenomena by balancing out, perhaps, the extent to which they are phonetic and the extent to which they are phonological. But I've situated my works within sort of laboratory phonology. Maybe the laboratory part is not entirely essential, but a lot of phonological theorization implies that you can still work out, you can do things to ascertain where the phenomena goes. You might have a formalism which describes aspects of phenomena clearly, or generates hypotheses that you can then use experimental work to test. You can also look down to physiology or neurology, or across to social patterning to try and explain some of the phenomena that you're interested in from a different dimension. And you can use ideas and reasoning from within phonology itself to conceptualize, married to previous work in the literature, or looking at other phenomena within the language you're interested in, or similar phenomena in other languages, to make an argument about what the nature of the vowel harmony or co-articulation or contrast or whatever it is that you're interested in is involved. Now, the trouble is that there are still these levels, and they are linked problematically, and there's things that the problematicness of the links make these sort of straightforward hypothesis and test, or taking predictions from formalism, it makes them quite difficult to apply in the real world, because phonology and phonetics have a number of characteristics. So one of them is mismatching, And the trouble with mismatching is that it actually makes you ask whether phonological entities require any phonetic evidence for their existence at all. And if there is a requirement for evidence, then which phonological entities are testable using what sorts of evidence? And we know that phonetics is far broader than phonology. Phonetics has to do with the sound properties and the sound generation properties and the perception of them by the human animal, and their transmission in physical and acoustic media. It's not all about language. So phonetics goes beyond language. So which bits of the phonetics are actually relevant to phonology is a tricky question. And it's tricky because of certain sorts of mismatches. So phonological identity, for example, the lack of phonological difference between one thing and another can actually be correlated with phonetic differences. And this is a phenomenon I'll look at a little bit, and I've looked at in the past, covert contrast, and I'll give you an examples from R gestures. And then there is a sort of a different sort of mismatch, which is where you have phonological differences, but there is no phonetic difference detectable. These are quite popular in formal phonology. This is a case where you might have abstract segments or phantom segments or underspecification, which is then given redundant content through a derivation before phonetics comes into play. So you permit yourself the ability to have phonological structures which aren't interpreted or can't be interpreted with phonetic difference. That's an interesting mismatch between level that makes experimentation, for example, difficult. Another issue, which is almost the opposite, is parallelism, where you have similarities in phonology and phonetics. Now, are these problematic or are these insightful? Now, sometimes we use different terms, so we might sort of say, well, that there's a parallelism here, but it's problematic, so we'll use two different terms. We'll talk about assimilation on the one hand, co-articulation on the other. Now, the phenomena, we know, the elephant in the room is, they're quite similar, but we have two different terms, so maybe that's okay. We've distinguished them, but the similarity, it's still there to be dealt with and explained. On the other hand, we might use one term like palatalization, and we might use that term in phonology and in phonetics, or, for example, the use of slanted and square brackets around a symbol or a feature. In that case, we're sort of promoting the similarity, while the elephant in the room is that actually we know that palatalization in phonology just isn't really all that much like palatalization in phonetics. Another problem, which is something I worried about in my thesis days, was concreteness, which is asking what level of detail can you have in the phonology? What phenomena are represented in the phonological system, in addition to the basic phenomenon of contrast? Let's say, take that as a starting point. I contrast, therefore I am phonological. What else on top of that? Is there a principled reason for that? Because what phonology is normally thought to formalize, what phonology is normally thought to try to formalize, is much less than what speakers learn. Speakers learn a great deal of detail when they're learning their language. So there are presumably some redundant elements in phonology, but how much? Then there's the problem of change. Change is about moving between one level and another, either diachronic or developmental. And while change is accepted, by and large, there aren't particularly strong theories of change that take into account the two-level approach. Just saying that something moves or that something stays in the same level doesn't quite capture what people feel is going on with change between levels. And finally, I want to mention the idea of fuzziness, which is when we come to consider a phonology, a person's phonology, is it static? Is it complete? Is it deterministic on the basis of what they say? Have I got one phonology which is possible to describe? Or are things more confusing than that? A lot of experimental work suggests confusion or fuzziness because of, for example, even just the strength of contrast, the fact of contrast, can be evidenced with one good minimal pair, as the structuralists showed in the last century. But the strength of the contrast, that can be influenced by all sorts of things, include frequency factors, or the tasks, or the knowledge of the speaker, and so on. And the question is really about whether there is a mismatch here between the goals. Do we have experiments that can't quite capture the clear philosophical nature of contrast, or is contrast itself embedded in substance in the real world? So if you have a phonology and a phonetics which are rigidly discrete, two clear different domains, then normally the way that people conceive of it is phonology as a system of abstract categorization, whereas phonetics is gradient and soft. It deals with real time, real spaces in the world. It's about the realization of the abstract system in the mind or in speech. And if these ways of looking at things are so straightforwardly distinct, you might ask yourself, well, why is the interface so hard to pin down if we've got abstractness on the one hand and gradients on the other? What's the problem? Well, there can be internal factors which give rise to difficulty in deciding whether something is phonological or phonetic. And one is the existence of words, because words cross-cut both these systems. Phonological entities may have a high functional load and be very useful in distinguishing one word from another, or they may have a very low or indeed no functional load. They may appear frequently in the lexicon or in usage, or they may be rare. In terms of sound systems, the actual sounds in use in a language to express and encode the contrast could be easy to learn, simple, evidenced in many languages, or they could be complex and marked in their own right. They could be marked in their own right, or they could be part of an extremely complex sound system. So these are internal. But there's also something I want to get onto, really, is the core of this talk in terms of the different perspectives element, which is, whose phonology is it that we're talking about? Is it the phonology here in my head, my cognitive construct, my own personal system? Or is it, for example, something like we might be sharing at the moment? We're sharing a language at the moment. You're listening, I'm speaking in the same language. So what are the phonological and phonetic elements of that? And then there's synchrony and diachrony, which are maybe a little bit, I don't need to go into them too much, I think. So moving away from a discrete, rigid phonology, phonetics, is the sort of approach that I would probably prefer, which is to do with exemplar theory and fuzziness, in which phonology is an abstract systemization and labeling. It may not be complete, it may not be well formed, but it's embedded in the substance, so that categories are more or less evidenced, they're more or less categorical. And it's a labeling and systemization of clouds, which are themselves more or less well formed or distinct from each other. These are exemplars in some multidimensional and highly redundant phonetic space. Now, in the way I've described that, and I'm sure in your knowledge too, it would seem obvious that the relationship between phonetics and phonology can, as in terms of mismatch and fuzziness and parallelism and so on that I started with, those could be expected. Those are things which are exemplar theory is quite good at capturing. But what I'm going to claim or try and argue for today is that this is not complex enough, and that we need some more systemization of the complexity. Now, this is not to say that the proponents of exemplar theory are not aware of how complex things are. I think they are entirely aware of the different perspectives of the self, of others, and of language. But it's interesting how, when you look particularly at core writings in the field, you find some of the same ambiguities that appear in more traditional writing to do with discrete categorical phonology versus phonetics perspectives. So Janet Pierre-Humbert, for example, just for an example, 20 years ago when establishing the field, made it quite clear what exemplar theory was about. It was a way to formalize detailed phonetic knowledge that native speakers have about the categories of their language. But notice that this is stated as a plural. It's about native speakers, plural, and their language. So this is a particular perspective. She goes on to say that since exemplar theory stores directly the distribution of phonetic parameter values associated with each label, it provides us with a picture of the implicit phonetic knowledge of the speaker, my emphasis. So now we've left plural speakers and we have implicit knowledge of a single speaker. And the acquisition of this knowledge can be understood simply in terms of the acquisition of a large number of memory traces of experiences. Well, memory traces is a bit ambiguous, isn't it, between my memory traces as an individual speaker and our memory traces as a community. And this type of ambiguity is fairly pervasive in terms of frequency counts or categories, in terms of the interaction between speaker and hearer and so on. And that's very much what I'm trying to pull to the fore, to focus attention on that sort of ambiguity, the philosophical factor. Whose phonology is it? Phonology as a cognitive construct in some way or as a community system? So that previous quote sort of danced a little bit, I think, between the speaker and between native speakers. So we abstract all these experiences and memories, but whose experiences and memories of what? So I've got my memories of me. I've got my memories of some of you that I've spoken to and interacted with individually, and maybe some of you as representatives of groups with a particular accent, a particular phonology, whose my experience with similar phonologies will help me interact with you. Then there's your experiences. Now, you may well, some of you I know have had experiences with me and my voice and my phonology, my system, and as well as your own experiences of yourselves, which I'm not privy to. You also have experiences of other speakers like me. May well be that it's only Sean Connery or some other figure who has, or a Shrek even, who is purportedly Scottish or has elements of Scottish phonology, but is just an impersonation by an American, Canadian actor. I think he's Canadian. But these are complex issues about who's remembering what. So tokens, the phonology, the phonetics, these are, I'm not producing sounds, I'm producing words. You're not perceiving sounds and voices all the time. You're generally speaking looking for lexical, prosodic, intonational, semantic, syntactic content, as well as recognizing individuals and dealing with emotions and distances of near and far and clarity and all the other issues. Words are really important to phonology and phonetics. And the words, well, I'm Scottish with a Scottish phonology. Some of you may well be from south of India with an interesting phonology of English. You may have extremely sort of RP-orientated English. You might have American-orientated English. It doesn't really matter. We all deal on a regular basis with people whose phonologies and phonetics are rather different to ours, but we share something else when we speak a language, and that's the words, the lexicon. The grammar and the lexicon are really important. It's words that are spoken, and they're spoken by me, and they're spoken by you, and they're heard. Now, most of the speaking that I'm aware of is my speaking. I will be aware of your speaking. I can see your lips move. I can make judgments about what articulations have occurred inside your mouth by listening to you, but most of my knowledge and experience of speaking is my speaking, my face, my vocal cords, my lungs. For hearing, it's the other way around. Most of my experiences is of other people. Well, when I say most, every time I speak, I hear myself. So there is a question there that we'll come back to in a wee while about who I hear most. Maybe I hear myself more than I hear any other individual, but I suspect that the amount of speech I hear is still predominantly other people's speech. And we form abstractions. You do, I do, and we abstract across all of these. So we're abstracting at a word level, at a language level. We're abstracting at an articulatory speaking level. We're abstracting at a listening perceptual level. And we are making all sorts of other judgments about personality, sociolinguistic backgrounds, if we know anything, arousal, and so on. So these last comments I made are related to the fact that both phonetics and phonology are parts of bigger models, such as sociolinguistics or theories of bilingualism or the learning of second language or infant acquisition or language processing or psycholinguistics or acoustics or whatever. All sorts of other people other than phonologists and phoneticians are interested in phonetics and phonology for a wide range of reasons. And I'm going to set that kind of to the side, but I want to just sort of talk a little bit about this sort of speech chain type side of things before getting on to examples. So, because this is a way of introducing the idea that's absolutely standard, is that there's more than one phonetics. So we might well just have phonology, but there are different types of phonetics. We have perceptual, articulatory, neurological, acoustic, and these feed into each other. So we have the sort of, the phonology is rather mysteriously somewhere characterized somehow to all of these different types of phonetics. And this ability to look at different phonetics at different times in different ways is at the core not just of speech production and perception, but of sound change as well. So the social model or of Walhalla, where the listener is the source of sound change, I hope is familiar. And the idea is that speakers' phonological system includes articulatory changes due to phonetic-y level palatalization, say, where the listener does not undo the phonetic palatalization, but interprets it instead as something that is palatal at a phonological level, and then goes on to produce that palatalness independently from the original conditioning environment. So the phonologization occurs when the palatal loses its palatalization in the phonetics. Now, in my own work, excuse me a second. In my own work, ideas like that were helpful and useful for thinking about change in Scottish rhoticity. Now, this is change which is not fed through, we think, to phonology yet. And actually, there's a question about whether, to what extent this is change and to what extent it's stable. I think those are two sides of the same diachronic issue. We can just look at what we have around us now and follow it up in the years and decades to come. So in this work, we've looked at coda R, which has become acoustically weak. We say de-rhoticized. We don't mean non-rhotic. We mean that the rhoticity, the acoustic rhoticity, has weakened. And when I say we, I very much want to point to Eleanor Lawson and James Stuart Smith at this point, with whom this work has been done over many years. So coda R might sound like it disappears. It might sound like it's been replaced by a schwa or similar sort of phenomena. And this is because the coda, there's a coronal delay. There's a delay in the production of some parts of the R using the tongue blade. So after these sort of non-low vowels, so five vowels, we have pairs of words like fear in my type of accent, very middle class type accent. In the more vernacular, WC, working class, vernacular accent, people, which I'll attempt to produce for you, people would say this top row of words before silence with an R that was very weak. So we'd have forms like fear, hair, air, boa, boer. And they would be in contrast with an R-less form, in phonologically R-less form. So we have fear versus fee, fear, fee, hair, hay, boa, bo, boer, boo. And before consonants, beard, bead, pailed, paid, herd, head, board, bode, good, good. So those are just sort of phonological minimal pairs impersonated by me to show that there is reasonable productions with a very weak R, which has been turned into something else. So what else is it sort of really being turned into? Well, we find in our work that articulatorily, oftentimes there is still an articulatory R there. So in a word like hair, which starts with a vowel, so this is an ultrasound image, we've got the tongue tip on the right, up, articulatory high is up the screen, and the tongue root is on the left. So this thick blue line is showing roughly the shape for a vowel A. And the first thing that happens in the production of a word like hair is that the tongue root retracts, and that gives us half of the articulation of the R. But when the tongue root is retracted and the tongue body lowers perhaps a bit, we end up with a shape that's rather like schwa, so something that is fairly clear. So we have an hair. And then at the end of the word, the tongue blade raises to give a more canonical R token. And that's what you'll get with productions like mine, hair. But when somebody says hair, a more vernacular speaker, this tongue blade raising has been masked by silence. The acoustic energy at the end of the word has disappeared, and the R is produced sometimes with a little bit of voiceless energy, hair, sometimes with none. And there's a nice rotating tongue shape that helps you see not just that the tongue is raising, but there is a little bit of retraction and movement. Now that's rather different though in words like bird and word, and also with some low vowels that I don't have time to talk about. Because in these words, when R is masked by the lack of acoustic energy in silence, so the tongue raising is not energized by acoustic energy, or if there's a following consonant which cuts voicing off or introduces another consonantal articulation, then we can get something that sounds much more like merger. So in this case, H-U-R-T on the left here, hut, sounds really rather like H-U-T, hut. And in the speech of particular speakers, you can perhaps hear this. So I'm hoping that you can now hear some acoustic examples. I'll play these and you can decide whether this is H-U-R-T or H-U-T. So here's a female speaker.
Hut, 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 hut.
Okay, well, what we had here was the first one is hut.
Hut.
And the second one is
hut.
Hurt, but with very strong deroticization. And where the tongue movement that we showed with ultrasound is not really audible in the acoustics. So we know that the speaker is making an effort to produce an R, but you can't really particularly hear it. Here's another pair.
Hot.
From a male speaker.
Hot. 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 Hot.
I think this one's a wee bit easier because this phenomenon is not 100% neutralization. It's about weakness of contrast, and I think I can hear the distinction there fairly well. I can hear that this one is
hot,
hot, whereas the second one is
hot.
Oh, you might not have, if you can't see my, let me just check. Oh yes, you can see which one I'm playing, that's okay. So we have the potential for minimal pairs like curt and cut being merged into cut and cut. Before silence, where the R might be lost, with words like sa, fa, monster, and h. There's no minimal pair there. It's just a sort of phonotactic loss. Now, I can't show you movies of this because I'm playing on a Mac, and so I can't demonstrate. But hopefully, we can make those available later. So, what model did we propose? Well, we sort of thought instead of the speech chain, we thought of a speech triangle. So, acoustics helps generate a representation and goes back to acoustics. That's very much the speech chain, linear. So we have input and output. But if we think about articulation, to add that in, then we have phonological representations leading to articulatory outputs, a sort of speaker-orientated output, something where there is actually an articulation of a coda R that we can observe in ultrasound data, which then leads to some acoustics, which makes it hard, or perhaps for some speakers impossible to hear, for some listeners, impossible to hear that there is a rhotic there. So the representation leads to both speaker-orientated output and a listener-orientated output. And our claim, I think, or our model was to say that the speaker is attempting to do two things at once, to both articulate in a certain way and to sound like they're doing something different. And so this then becomes ambiguous at the phonological representation level. The R is definitely there, but if the intention is to sound like it's not really there, then what's going on? So what will happen next? In the case of the preconsonantal vowel, we might expect mergers in the future diachronically, or perhaps there'll be new vowels created to maintain contrast. Those seem to be two sort of straightforward phonological avenues that could be taken. And then in the silence cases, maybe we would expect something like happened in the history of RP, where we have words like sir and fur with a long vowel to show that there used to be an R there, but not in Scottish English, where we have sa and fa. And we seem to maybe be moving towards monomeraic monosyllables, which would be rather marked in the languages of the world. So we might be able to sort of estimate or guess or look or have a model about what might happen next, but we can't be sure. So we have phonology, we have some production, and we have perception. So this is very much a sort of model of what I've just been talking about. We've got more than one type of phonetics, and we've got a phonology, and we've got two levels. So the horizontalness here is really about having two levels. And what I want to say is that this is still far too person-centered. It's still too derivational. It's too chain-like, and we need to move away from having only one phonology and two or maybe more types of phonetics, but into thinking about there being more than one type of phonology. I mean, otherwise, this is just a sort of ideal speaker here of Chomsky and Halley with a little bit of psycholinguistics or speech production thrown in. And is this speaker, is it an individual, cognitive, or is it community, or what? What about all the other dimensions and things that map in that we might want to consider? They don't fit very well with these simple models. I'm going to do this in terms of three things: trichotomy and triangulate them. And why do this? We've got phonetics and phonology, so why try for a triangle? Well, triangles are very popular. Trichotomies are very popular in these sorts of ways. And I think this is where the sort of view of self, others, and language connects a little bit to other philosophical perspectives on other things. We have Popper's worlds. We have the physical public world. We have the world of mind and thought, and then a more sort of conceptual theoretical world. That's not really what I'm aiming for, I don't think, but it's a sort of another trichotomy. Maybe I should stick with dichotomy, like Saussure, and just have abstract language and then use. Maybe that would be the way to go. Another sort of dichotomy, however, is otherness and selfhood, and I think it's really important to think about the self and others. So this is the sort of model that I'm going to try and suggest. It's a three-way model, and it's going to be a way of looking at phonology and phonetics from those three different perspectives. So it's not a very explicit model, it's very fluffy and philosophical, if you like. I think that's the right way. So I've got about 5 minutes left, I think. So we'll just talk about roughly what these might be like. So other ways if you can think about me, use lot. In Scottish English we have use as a plural. Anybody else can understand it as a plural, I think. And then language as it. So what is thinking of just about the green section there labeled self or me, which does not overlap with language or others. So this is just the self. This is me, which is not to do with other people and is not to do with language. So this is to do with my personality, my mind brain. Others. What is it about others that is not about me, not about language? Well, that's sort of thinking about society or even history. It's very disembodied. It's about groups and communities. And then language. Well, what about language could you abstract away from the human self? Well, universal grammar, the field of linguistics itself, study of typology, and metalinguistic concepts. Those are in the blue language box, which is not overlapping with people. What about the intersections? Well, if we intersect between me and you lot, well, that's our identities. We get to talk about our things, also to some extent my things, but our things, our social network. Other people that are known to me, my family, my work colleagues, my city, my country, my language speakers, not language speakers. Interaction between two people, me and somebody else. Also, my stereotypes of you or other people, an idea, shared culture, shared genetics. Maybe a sort of general concept of my theory of your mind. So this would be an intersection of self and others, which is not involving language. In the intersection of me and language, we have my idiolect. So my language, my lexicon, the words that I know, my competence, the things that I say and I use, my usage. Also, my memories of and my exemplars. Now, those can be memories of me, but they can also be memories, perhaps, of other things. But we're really here talking about my memories of language, not considering others. So all the words I've ever used, all the words I know, my vocal tract, my motor skills, my psycholinguistic processing, me right now talking. If I ignore the fact that you're there, out there on the ether, and I just am talking or using language in my head, or writing notes, making a PowerPoint, the quality of my voice and my intuitions about my language as well. But what about you and your language? Not me. So this would be Gujarati, perhaps, if there's some Gujarati speakers listening, or Tamil speakers, or the concept of French as a language. Somebody else's dialect that I don't speak, that I don't share, things that are shared between language and other people. So this is about other speech communities, things where I am not a member, because that would be the intersection of all three areas. The sound of other people's voices that are maybe not known to me. Your conversations, not that I am not part of. Also corpora and experiments, disembodied elements of language use. Curricula in linguistic programs, dictionaries. What is a dictionary but a collection of your language? It's not about me, but it's really about the standard form, and other linguistic artifacts fall in there. So now we get down to sort of the core, the intersection of all three things, language, you and me. So this is my speech communities. So speech community is what? It's not just me and my own. It's my groups of other people. It's the people with whom I converse. It's my dialect. It's my individual conversations and jokes and puns, the ways which I know how to change my speech towards other people in order to fit in with them, my process of learning speech and language from other people, and other people's learning of speech and language from me. So it's the relationship between me and my parents and between me and my children. It's also me just listening, not what I'm doing at the moment where I'm talking incessantly, but when I sit and I listen, or when I intuit or think about judgments about the language which you and I share in general, rather than perhaps just my own introspection about just myself. Now, that was the intersection of these three perspectives, me, you, and language, but some people feel uncomfortable about that. They feel that, well, that is the phenomenon that, or the extent of phenomenon that linguistics is interested in. So let's change the shape of the little triangular curved intersection into a circle and just say, well, yes, okay, but these phenomena can, if that's everything that there is, you can exaggerate or focus on me and my vocal tract, you and your experiences, or language and its characteristics independent of embodiment in any particular language that has existed in the world, so elements of universal grammar. So where are phonology and phonetics in this view? It's about, started off with phonology and phonetics as levels, but now where are they? Well, they're everywhere. Phonology and phonetics are in each of these three perspectives. There's more than one phonology, and there's more than one phonetics. And each of them, to take an exemplar perspective, it has got more or less abstract elements and more or less specific details. And it's all kind of fuzzy. Sometimes we're thinking more about perspective, and sometimes it's more about intersectionality. So for me, the self, the specific details are heavily articulatory because I have to move my articulators. But I need to take the acoustics of that into account because I am being perceived by others. And so you can see how the relative balance of phonetics and phonology, articulation, perception, acoustics, knowledge are different in each of these areas. So I'm just going to move to the end. I had a nice little bit that I don't have time to play to you, but it was nice that Eva Reinisch at LabPhon this year had some very nice examples. And I think what she was talking about there was about second language acquisition and the effect of one's own accent on perception. Very nice talk. I would recommend having a look at that. And it speaks very much to some of the things that I'm trying to say. So just a couple more slides to finish. We have to, I think, find comfort in multiple perspectives. We need partial phonetic perspectives. And I think all of us are happy with the idea that somebody might work in acoustics, somebody else might work in articulation, somebody else might work on psycholinguistic neurology or perception time or storage in the brain, and that those are all reasonable perspectives. They all fit together. There's real-time processing, offline intuition, there's metalinguistics. It's all valid phonetically. But there isn't a lot of explicit acknowledgement of how the different perspectives of me as an articulator versus you as a perceiver, for example, or me as a perceiver and you as an articulator, how that different balance comes to play. On the other hand, phonologists tend to assume that there's one phonology, that it's well-formed, neat, tidy, it has limits, it fits a language, and it's shared by multiple people. And in this case, the sort of implicit changes of perspective between the monolingual, the bilingual, the speaker, the hearer, me and other members of my speech community, those can be more problematic. And so my claim is that we need multiple phonologies too. We need a sort of an language type phonology, one that's typological, abstract, it has structures and features. It's aiming to try and capture what's universal in languages that are and have been spoken, but it's not really grounded in humanist concerns about usage or the ability of people to speak and hear. Then there's a phonological theory that focuses on the body and the mind and the knowledge of individuals. It incorporates production, but also perception. And then there's a sort of a phonological theory that focuses more on shared social systems, talking about variation in society and acoustics. So I think linguistics is actually hampered by the search for a language, that the idea that there is a language, that there is a one perspective. And I think that these perspectives are probably sufficient, maybe 3 perspectives. I don't think each one of them is exhaustive. I think that things can be rather vague. We also need to consider abstractness, learning, and physical influences. And I think that slide can do to finish on, so that I'm not too much over time. So thank you very much. There is no single interface. There is no one phonology, no one phonetics, but instead different balances depending on whether we're talking about the self, others, or disembodied language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for that very engaging talk and for sort of shaking things up, really. Right, and right, we have a bunch of questions for you waiting. I'll just get to them. All right, I'll go in order. So here's the, okay. Yeah, the first one on your screen. Is it possible to draw a line of demarcation between experimental phonetics and laboratory phonology? Does the difference lie only in emphasis or approach? Asks Hemanga Datta.
I think that experimental phonetics is far broader because it is interested in things that phonologists might not be interested in, such as what your voice sounds like first thing in the morning as opposed to in the evening, or how your changing vocal tract as you mature and age into elderly life affects your perceptibility, perhaps, or people's impression of you as being a friendly person, or who knows? You know, there's a wide range of experimental phonetic phenomena. Also, something I didn't mention is speech technology. So our mobile phones, our telephone lines, our automatic translation. Some of these things are more phonologically oriented. That would be language translation. And some of them are more phonetically oriented, such as a hearing aid or a phone, because there's more to sound than just speech, particularly in the case of something like a hearing aid. If it was a laboratory phonology approach, then it would only be about perceiving words. And experimental phonetics goes far beyond that, I think.
Right. Next is a comment from Indranil, who just sort of says Mike Myers is Canadian and has self-reported Scottish heritage. Yeah, right. Okay, so we have. Yeah, go on.
He's not great at the Scottish accent. I mean, it's like a lot of people. He has got his stereotypes. So he's brought up in Canada. He has access to this knowledge. So this is the sort of interesting question. What is Shrek's phonology? Okay. What contrasts does Shrek make? What phonetic targets does Shrek have? He tends, I think, to trill his rhotic, which is fairly uncharacteristic of current Scottish speakers, but is a reasonable thing from a heritage perspective. And all of us have got a system which is ours, but which is based on the experience of hearing parents, friends, television programs, and so on. So I think that this sort of he's acting and he's putting something on, but we're all acting. I'm acting right now. This is not the way I speak all the time, but I don't think I'm changing any elements of my phonology. Whereas he certainly was making use of some bidialectal knowledge. And one of the things that we're very interested in, as well as with my colleague, I didn't put up the final slide's gone now.
Oh, you can share that back, yeah? You can put that back up.
Thank a few people, but my colleagues Sonia and Scheffler and I are interested in bidialectalism as well as bilingualism. Bilingualism, different syntax, grammar, lexis, and all the rest of it. Bidialectalism, there's phonological differences and there are phonetic differences, and it's actually a really difficult and interesting topic.
Yeah, right. We have a comment from Professor K.P. Mohanan, who says, would you be open to an open conversation, say in a discussion forum, to explore these extremely interesting ideas in detail, which I think would be of great value to young researchers? And he has,
Of course. And I read with interest the Mohanan's paper from last week, or
the last week,
where exactly some of these sort of issues and topics, in fact, arose. There was a nice diagram on, somewhere near the top, and I think it was triangular. I can't quite remember. Now I was thinking about putting it in, and in the end, thought I'm not going to tread too or toes.
Yeah. So sorry, and he's suggesting a bunch of topics for this. For this discussion. I'm sure we can set something up. Yeah. Sorry, did I cut you off there, Jim? Were you going to say something more when I sort of put this up? No, yeah, okay, all right. Indranil has a question. He says, failure to compensate for co-articulatory acoustic variation perceptually leads to phonologization, but the threshold for this process for acoustic variation to become phonological, is it parametric?
I'm not sure, and I think the failure to compensate for co-articulatory acoustic variation can lead to phonologization. Yes, it can, but it doesn't have to. And so there's failure to compensate. So we need a theory of failure to compensate. We really need to know why people might compensate or might not compensate because of what? Because of perceptibility at a sort of abstract level of just noticeable difference, or because of previous experience, because of awareness of the importance of a contrast, because of at a functional load level or at a social level. So the theory of failure to compensate, there's a lot in there, actually, and I think that's one of the interesting issues, is just to be able to sort of think about making some predictions and leading to phonologization as well. I think yes, I think these are sort of the Ohala stages, but I don't think we've got a very good handle on what phonologization is. The Ohala model sort of suggests that it only happens between generations. The speaker is different from the perceiver, and I just think that that's easy to challenge, that adults can change and phonologize in different ways. We have an awful lot of phonological intuition based on orthographic literacy teaching. And as literate speakers of one or multiple languages, we are given phonologizations that are extremely strong, and they are set into a social context where a literary or orthographic set of phonological generalizations are socially prestigious.
Yeah.
So we have social and we have orthographic. And as an adult, on the other hand, particularly I think looking at adults who are speakers of oral languages, which may be low prestige and which are not written down and not discussed, you can have very interesting questions about what the phonology is. And I am not convinced that that this model of one well-formed phonology, a bit of failed compensation and another well-formed phonology at a later diachronic stage, I'm not really convinced that that's what would be predicted. So maybe that's what's in your question about the threshold for the process. When does how much of this do you need to become phonological? And there's the question. Yes,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right. He has one more question. Language is public action. The Goldstein-Fowler idea. How does your idea of multiple phonetics phonologies play with that idea?
I'm not. Don't think I'm as familiar as I should be with language as public action as a terminology. That's something that has ringing bells, but I'm not particularly clear on how to answer that without just making something up. But I think that the orientation of the general articulatory phonology school or group originally had a lot to do with speech articulation, in which acoustic and other effects were epiphenomenal. And I think later there was more interest in viewing some of those epiphenomena of segmental type level entities being planned or intentional, so maybe listener oriented or segment oriented rather than parametric score variation. Is that I don't know if that's really answering, but I think the idea of multiple phonologies would intersect with that idea, because when you're a speaker controlling articulation, you can nevertheless be interested in the acoustic effects of what it is that you're producing. And that speeding up or slowing down or emphasizing the strength of a gesture or diminishing the strength of a gesture at a parametric level, I think seems very gradient. But if you don't take into account the publics, the others, the percepts, then you're missing something. But the percepts are, I think, of at least three or four different types. One is, what was the sound? So what sound are you generating? Are you generating a particular segment? There's what word is it? So there's sort of a question of phonology in the service of lexical distinctiveness. And then there's contrastability. So there's lots of words, for example, and the pair of words I gave you to listen to is hut and hurt, which are a minimal pair. But there's lots of words with an R in them which don't have a minimal pair. So let's take a word like let's take 30. 30. So if somebody is aiming to produce the word 30 and they pronounce it as 30, there's not really the problem, particularly in context, maybe if you're talking about, there isn't a problem of being misunderstood. So contrast maintenance doesn't require the presence of the R, or a strongly rhotic R. You can use a weakly rhotic R. You could lose the R altogether. But there's other things going on, such as social meaning and accommodation and speaker orientedness that might be relevant. That's also relevant in the case where you might be misperceived. So I think that these different, in exemplar theory and maybe in articulatory phonology, there's an awful lot of statistical work. But when you drill down into one experimental study, it's very hard to discover the effect of one word and whether that one word, particularly if it's a nonsense word, is being articulated in a certain way. So you might need some huge experiment to work out whether what's the effect of perceiving a particular style of production of a particular type of word. I think it's very difficult.
Right.
Challenging.
Right. Okay. Here's our next question by Dr. Suja Matthews, who asks, how well can theories of normalization explain the sphere variability in understanding phonetic variability?
So normalization, I guess, is one of these. It implies that we've got normalization will work when there is a norm and when there is variance from a norm. So we need a distribution of some kind. It doesn't need to be a bell-shaped curve. It could have other forms of variability in there. But there are oftentimes when we're talking about normalization, we're talking about pulling the things together so that stuff is more similar, I guess. That could be to do with rate normalization or pitch normalization or formant normalization to see how people perceive. But at the same time, we do know that that the causes of variation are themselves perceived, I guess, so that we perceive gender, we perceive rate and effort, we perceive age, social variance, and so on. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
No problem. We'll move on to the next question. So this asks, Krishna asks, given the fuzziness and gaps between the phonological and phonetic levels, can we reliably establish a connection between a contrastive phonetic cue and its corresponding phonological feature?
Okay, I feel fairly happy to say no.
Right. Yeah.
So the question is, can we establish a connection? That's probably not the right question to ask, because it's a sort of yes/no question. So let's ask something a bit more difficult, which would be, what is the connection, or how ambiguous or how abstract can the connection be? So let's assume that there is a phonological stored. I don't want to say stored. That's just one element of phonology. Let's assume that there is some phonological category or entity, and let's assume that it is connected to phonetic stuff. So the question I would like to ask, I guess, is how reliable, how fuzzy, how abstract can they be, the connections? And presumably there are some connections that are relatively direct and easy, things that assist learnability and are maybe not very marked and show up again and again. 5 vowels, 5 contrasting vowels. Why 5? Why is 5 more common than 3, but 3 is still fairly common? Well, you have to bring in concept. There's a whole range of different functional factors. So if we seek functional explanations, there's usually, I think, an opposite functional explanation. So clarity is a great reason to, lexical distinctiveness is great, but on the other hand, there's also speaker laziness. It's also great. Ease of articulation is great. There's lots of contrasting phonological, phonetic-y, functional things. Given the gaps, can we reliably establish? Well, let's hope so. I said no. Let's say yeah, but it's going. There's a lot of work in there for sure. And it's not going to be something like. It's not going to be something like vowels are always voiced. They're not always voiced. That's what we do for a living. If vowels were always voiced, all of us could go home, because the problem are that there are these things that you want to call vowels,
Yeah.
but they're not voiced. So are they vowels? So then somebody gets a job.
Right. Right. Here's our next question from Himanga again. How can we represent phonological patterns if we rely on multiplicity of phonological models, especially in relation to idiolectal differences?
I think that the universal phonological patterns are going to have to be complicated, and they're going to have to be sort of big data type universals, I think, not simpler universals. So universals are already quite complicated, even if they're formulated on the basis of a typology or a collection of language descriptions that use phonemic descriptions, something like upsid or something wows or something.
Yeah.
So you've got these sort of typological descriptions. Now, in that typological description, it might say French. So it doesn't say Marseille French or upper class 80-year-old Parisian French, and it doesn't say my French when I'm tired. My French is a bilingual speaker of Berber or Arabic or whatever. But they're all real. They're all really there.
Yeah.
And I think that if we want to make universal phonological patterns on the basis of French does it like this, Hindi does it like this, Mandarin does it like this, and that's our database, that's okay. We get generalizations at the level of the material that goes into the generalization machine, the database.
Right.
And if we want to ask more difficult or complicated questions, which people often do, then maybe they shouldn't ask the questions if that's the data they've got. Maybe they should tailor the question to the granularity of the material that can answer the question.
Right. And in sort of, I think this is going to be a very simple question to answer.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. Yeah.
So there's nice work. So I was just on typology. Jason Shaw has done, I think, nice work on trying to do typological work that's more parametric. In sociophonetics, there is sometimes not a lot of phonology. The thing that would be nice to see more in phonology is what do people do with contrast? So that there's a name that's just escaping me at the moment. There's a nice paper on Jamaican English and clear speech, and this is something that I've been interested in for a while. So what do you do differently if somebody doesn't understand you and you would decide to speak a little bit more clearly? If you want to make your contrasts a little bit more likely to be perceived correctly, if you want to make a minimal pair really crisp, what do you do? You can speak louder and slower and so on and so forth, but also you can adopt sociophonetic features associated with the standard, but you can also change the phonology that you are using. You can make contrasts that you wouldn't normally make. And so I think that sociophonetics has got quite a lot to say to phonology, but sometimes it focuses more on the phonetics and a little bit less on the phonology. I think the work is particularly good at explaining phonological or suggesting routes for phonological change, but it maybe doesn't focus on some of the simple elements that it could do. I don't know, but I think it's very easy to combine.
Yeah, and your paper with Paul and Tom Watt on sociophonetics, I'd recommend that to everybody when you're starting to think about. I mean, they have suggestions on pretty well elaborating everything Jim's just said about the options that sociophonetics offers. Really, the scope it offers. The scope it offers to discussing, and answering questions in phonology. So I would highly recommend that one. Right. We have a question from Shakuntala who says recent developments in phonology include studies of gradients and social linguistic data as well. I'm sure this is the right direction, but will it be enough to capture multiple phonologies?
No, I don't think it is enough. I think that's my sort of concern here,
Yeah.
is that there's a lot of very good experimental work
Right.
in laboratory phonology, or if we want to call it that, or in the journal, or at the conference and so on. Very strong studies that look at processing, gradients and sociolinguistic variation, acquisition, disorder, all sorts of interesting things slightly around the edge of phonology. And the example I was thinking of such a particularly good study at the recent LabPhon conference was Eva Renish's work, published in Journal of Experimental Psychology or other, which is her paper in Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning Memory and Cognition, is titled The Impact of One's Own Voice and Production Skills on Word Recognition in a Second Language. So that topic, I think, very much, it pushes us beyond gradients and sociolinguistic data and brings in multiple phonologies. But at the same time, I think that this kind of thinking about who has the phonologies is implicit in that work, and I think it would it helps to make some of these things explicit.
Right. I mean, Shakuntala had a related sort of, I mean, together with the other one, she says, how do we have a model of so many levels of abstractions?
Just do something small. I think for me personally, I think academic research has quite a lot to do with personality and just outlook on life. And I don't think it's necessary to have a complete description.
Yep.
So I think it's possible to have a model of parts. And I think that it's not necessary for one person or one generation of people to solve all the problems all at once. The question is which questions do you try and solve? So questions that you try and issues that you try and model, or questions you try and solve, are quite often problematic at the moment. There's something about our current understanding that doesn't work particularly well, or there are new techniques or instrumentations or experimental approaches or something that can find out something new.
Right.
A language that's never been properly studied before, and a piece of descriptive work can open everybody's eyes, because there are phenomena there that people previously thought were impossible or something. Very, very important to do work. But you don't need to do everything. It's so many levels. Yeah, I'm, because of, as I say, I just feel it's not necessary to push everything into one level of abstraction. That's what I'm trying to avoid doing, is to have a very constrained cube, which everything's inside or outside. Being myself in that view has been somewhat liberating.
Right. Right. We have, I think, one or two more to get through. Do we recognize the issues listener phonology in a speech act when the speaker phonology is devoid of suprasegmental features of their standard? I think this is also the issue with the character limit. So I think people are finding it frustrating to sort of type out. Yeah.
I think people talking across different varieties was really interesting. And the suprasegmental side of things, I'm not a prosodist, but I just think it's incredibly important. I'm a segmentalist, I guess, really at heart, or a phonetician at heart. And I'm sort of segmental phonetics. But if you've got to take the segmental features of your own and other varieties into account, yes.
Into account, yeah, that makes sense. Then one last question. Okay. Is it that we can differentiate the phonology of hearing impaired and mentally challenged patients?
There's really interesting work on the phonetics, I think, of blindness, hearing impairment, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. There's lots of interesting work, I think, on the phonetics there.
But not so much.
Not really the phonology, I don't think.
Yeah.
Phonologically relevant phonetics. There's maybe or rounding. So there's nice work on lip and tongue placement for rounded vowels, production on. I'm not so sure people have really found phonological differences there, but I think it would be very interesting, particularly if you can get away from literacy.
Right. Well, Jim, just to show you very quickly, lots of thank yous and people saying that they really loved it and congratulating us for organizing this. So I guess everybody's happy. But before we get sort of conclude and everything, we have something to share with you as a small token of our appreciation. I'm going to wait for the sharing to begin, which will in any second now, really. I think we're just, it's coming up. So, okay, you're muted, Jim. I think you've muted yourself. I can't seem to unmute you. 1 second.
I see somebody familiar.
So this is by Miss Koil Biswas, who recently earned her master's degree in linguistics and language technology from Tezpur University. She hails from Kangla in Assam, and she has a keen interest in traditional and digital painting and sketching. So thank you, Koil. She done clearly. Yeah. So we will, when things get better, we have plans to sort of get this to you in a physical form as well. We can share it, in its soft form, but yeah, just something for you to remember us by. So, that sort of brings us to the end of things. But, of course, thank you once again, Jim, for the absolutely wonderful talk, for sort of, forcing us to think outside the box, really, about some of these, in some sense, fundamentals that we tend to take for granted and sort of, carry, we learn it a certain way, and then we tend to sort of, not question some of the fundamentals. So I think it's great that you've, like I said, when you ended the talk, for shaking things up. And thank you to the audience for all these wonderful questions that came in. I also want to, again, just thank the participants for joining us. And please note that our next talk is next Tuesday, the 10th of November, by Laura McPherson. You can visit our website for more details. And of course, we will be sharing the posters and other details to all of you very soon. On that note, really, thank you all once again. That's all from us today. Take care and goodbye.